The crystal chandeliers trembled as Queen Isabella's voice echoed through the grand ballroom of Valdoria Palace. 300 of the kingdom's most influential guests fell silent, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. What they expected to be a routine charity gala announcement was about to become the most shocking revelation in the monarchy's 800-year history. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Queen began, her usually steady voice carrying an unfamiliar tremor. "Tonight, Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Sophia have something unprecedented to share with our nation." Behind the ornate golden curtains, palace staff members exchanged worried glances. They had served the royal family for decades, some for their entire careers, but none had ever witnessed such tension radiating from the usually composed royals. The head butler, Charles Whitmore, noticed how the prince's hand shook as he adjusted his ceremonial medals, while Princess Sophia's normally perfect posture seemed to waver under an invisible weight. What the gathered elite and millions watching the live broadcast didn't know was that this single announcement would trigger the most dramatic transformation in royal history, leaving centuries of tradition hanging by a thread and forcing an entire kingdom to question everything they thought they knew about their beloved monarchy. The secret that Alexander and Sophia were about to reveal would not only shock the world, but set in motion a chain of events that would test the very foundation of the crown, challenge the loyalty of those closest to the throne, and ultimately determine whether the House of Valdoria would survive the modern age or crumble under the weight of its own hidden truths. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Valdoria Palace as Crown Prince Alexander Frederick William stood at the window of his private study, watching the gardeners tend to the rose bushes that had bloomed here for over 2 centuries. His reflection in the ancient glass showed a man bearing the weight of a decision that would change everything he had ever known. At 35, Alexander possessed the classical features that had made the House of Valdoria famous throughout Europe, but today those features were marked by sleepless nights and an inner turmoil that threatened to consume him. The ornate mahogany desk behind him was scattered with documents that would never see the light of day in any official capacity. Letters from investigative journalists, financial reports that didn't add up, and most damning of all, a leather-bound journal that belonged to his late grandfather, King Edmund. The journal's yellowed pages contained secrets that could topple governments and destroy alliances that had taken generations to build. Princess Sophia Catherine Elizabeth entered the study without knocking, a privilege reserved for only the most trusted members of the royal family. Her marriage to Alexander 3 years earlier had been celebrated as a fairy tale union. But the woman who approached him now carried herself with the determination of someone who had looked into an abyss and chosen to leap. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a casual sweater and jeans that would have scandalized the palace protocol officers, but these were no longer ordinary times. "The Prime Minister's office called again," she said, settling into the leather armchair that had once belonged to Alexander's great-grandmother. "They want to know what tonight's announcement will cover. Margaret is getting nervous." Alexander turned from the window, and Sophia could see the same haunted expression that had been growing more pronounced over the past 3 months, ever since they had stumbled upon the truth that now threatened to tear apart everything they held dear. "Margaret has good reason to be nervous. When this comes out, her government will face questions they're not prepared to answer. The discovery had been accidental, as world-changing revelations often are." While renovating the east wing of the palace for a new children's charity headquarters, workers had found a hidden room behind what everyone believed was simply a decorative wall panel. Inside, Alexander and Sophia had discovered documents spanning nearly a century, meticulously organized and preserved, revealing a web of corruption, illegal arms deals, and political manipulation that had funded the royal family's lavish lifestyle, while the kingdom struggled through economic hardships. "I keep thinking about what Charles said yesterday," Sophia murmured, referring to the head butler who had served the palace for 43 years, about how his father served King Edmund, and his grandfather served before that. 3 generations of his family have dedicated their lives to preserving what they believed was honor and duty. Alexander walked to his desk and picked up a photograph of his parents on their wedding day, their faces radiant with hope and innocence. "They had no idea, Sophia. My father spent his entire life believing he was upholding a legacy of service and dignity. If he were alive today, this would destroy him." The weight of their discovery had been crushing from the very beginning. The hidden documents revealed that King Edmund, beloved by his people and remembered as a patron of the arts and sciences, had secretly orchestrated arms sales to both sides during regional conflicts in the 1980s and 1990s. The profits had been funneled through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. With the money used to maintain the palace, fund the royal family's extensive travels, and support a lifestyle that far exceeded what the official royal budget could justify. But the corruption went deeper than financial impropriety. The documents revealed how the monarchy had used its influence to suppress investigations, silence whistleblowers, and manipulate media coverage. Political opponents had been discredited through carefully planted scandals, and business leaders who refused to participate in the schemes had found themselves facing sudden tax audits and regulatory challenges that destroyed their companies. Dr. Harrison called this morning, Sophia said, referring to the historian they had quietly consulted. She's confirmed the authenticity of the documents. There's no doubt about what we're looking at. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison had been their only confidant outside the palace walls, and her expertise in royal history had been invaluable in understanding the full scope of what they had uncovered. A professor emeritus at the University of Valdoria, she had spent decades studying the monarchy with admiration and respect, making her horror at the revelations all the more profound. Alexander sat down across from his wife, the leather creaking under his weight. Elizabeth also said something that's been haunting me. She reminded me that the people of this kingdom have built their entire sense of national identity around the idea that the royal family represents their highest values. When they learn the truth, it won't just be about us. It will shake their faith in everything they believe about themselves as a people. The kingdom of Valdoria was small but proud, nestled between larger European nations and maintaining its independence through careful diplomacy and a strong sense of cultural identity. The royal family had always been more than mere figureheads. They were living symbols of the nation's values, its continuity with the past, and its hopes for the future. Schools taught children about the noble sacrifices of previous monarchs, museums displayed artifacts that told stories of royal dedication to the public good, and the annual royal celebrations brought together citizens from all walks of life in expressions of shared pride and unity. "I've been thinking about the staff meeting tomorrow," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we tell Charles and Mrs. Patterson and all the others that everything they've believed about their life's work has been built on lies?" Ms. Eleanor Patterson had been the head housekeeper for 28 years, taking over the position from her own mother. She took personal pride in maintaining the palace's grandeur and often spoke to newer staff members about the honor of serving a family that had dedicated itself to the betterment of their people. The thought of seeing her face when she learned the truth made Alexander feel physically ill. The couple sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about the impossible situation they faced. Through the window they could see tourists gathering at the palace gates for the daily changing of the guard ceremony, many of them holding small Valdorian flags and taking photographs to commemorate their visit to what they believed was a symbol of everything noble and pure about monarchy in the modern world. "We could burn it all," Alexander said suddenly, his voice so quiet that Sophia had to strain to hear him. "Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence. We could have that room sealed up again, and no one would ever know." Sophia reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. "You don't mean that, don't I?" Alexander's eyes were filled with anguish. "Think about what we're about to do, Sophia. We're going to destroy the lives of everyone who works here, everyone who has ever believed in what we represent. We're going to devastate an entire nation's sense of itself. And for what? So that we can sleep better at night knowing we told the truth about crimes committed by people who are already dead." The moral complexity of their situation had been keeping them awake at night for months. On one hand, they both believed fundamentally in honesty and accountability, the idea of continuing to live a lie, of accepting the adoration of people who had been deceived, felt like a betrayal of everything they valued about themselves. But on the other hand, the consequences of revelation seemed almost too enormous to comprehend. "I keep thinking about my conversation with Father Miguel last week," Sophia said. Father Miguel Rodriguez had been the palace chaplain for 15 years, and his quiet wisdom had been a source of comfort to both of them during their courtship and marriage. He talked about the difference between truth that heals and truth that destroys, but then he said something that I can't get out of my head. He said that sometimes destruction is necessary before healing can begin. Alexander squeezed her hand, and sometimes destruction is just destruction. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the study door. Charles Whitmore entered, carrying a silver tray with their morning tea, a ritual that had been observed in this room for generations. His weathered face bore the dignity that came from a lifetime of service, and his movements had the precise, practiced grace of someone who had elevated domestic service to an art form. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "I wanted to inform you that the final preparations for tonight's event are complete. The ballroom has been prepared for 300 guests, and the broadcast arrangements have been confirmed with the national television network.
Thank you, Charles,
Alexander said, trying to keep his voice steady. I know this has been a lot of extra work for everyone. The elderly butler paused, and for a moment his professional composure seemed to waver slightly. If I may speak freely, Your Royal Highness, the staff has been concerned about you both. You've seemed troubled lately, and we want you to know that whatever challenges you're facing, you have our complete loyalty and support. After Charles left, Alexander and Sophia sat staring at the tea service, neither of them moving to pour. The simple, elegant china had been in the royal collection for over a century, each piece a small work of art that represented the refinement and tradition they were about to call into question. He said, "We have their loyalty," Alexander said finally. But loyalty to what? To us as people, or to what they think we represent? Maybe, Sophia replied. We're about to find out. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors and phone calls as the final details of the evening's event were confirmed. Representatives from the national television network arrived to conduct final checks of their equipment, while palace security coordinated with local police to manage the crowds that were expected to gather outside the palace gates. The anticipation in the air was palpable, with everyone from the kitchen staff to the senior advisors speculating about what the royal couple might announce. As evening approached, Alexander and Sophia began the ritual of preparing for their public appearance. The process, which had once felt natural and even enjoyable, now seemed like they were putting on costumes for a performance they no longer believed in. Sophia's gown, a deep blue creation that had been specially designed for the occasion, hung in their bedroom like an accusation. Alexander's ceremonial military uniform, with its brass buttons and colorful ribbons representing various honors and achievements, felt heavier than usual as he fastened each element in place. Their personal assistants, Margaret and James, worked with practiced efficiency to ensure every detail was perfect, unaware that they were preparing the royal couple for what might be their final official appearance. Margaret had been with Sophia since before her marriage, and her excitement about the evening was evident in her animated chatter about the guest list and the media coverage. James, who had served Alexander for over a decade, took particular care with the prince's appearance, adjusting each medal and ensuring that every aspect of the uniform met the exacting standards that royal protocol demanded. "The cars will be ready in 10 minutes, James announced, referring to the ceremonial convoy that would transport them the short distance from their private quarters to the main palace ballroom. I've been told that the crowds outside are quite large already." Through their bedroom window, Alexander and Sophia could indeed see the gathering crowds, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of streetlights and camera flashes. Many held signs expressing their love and support for the royal family, while others waved small Valdorian flags. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, hoping to catch a glimpse of the prince and princess who featured so prominently in the fairy tales they had been told since birth. As they prepared to leave their private quarters, Sophia took one last look around the room that had been their sanctuary throughout their marriage. The personal photographs, the books they had shared, the small mementos from their travels together, all seemed to take on a different quality in light of what they were about to do. This room had been where they had planned their future together, where they had dreamed of the contributions they would make as leaders of their people, where they had imagined raising children who would continue the royal tradition with honor and dignity. "Whatever happens after tonight," Alexander said, taking her hand as they walked toward the door, "I want you to know that I couldn't have faced this without you."
we're in this together.
Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. "Whatever comes next, we face it as partners." The corridor outside their quarters was lined with staff members who had assembled to wish them well, a tradition that had developed over the years as a way of showing support before important royal appearances. Tonight, however, the usual cheerful atmosphere was tinged with an undercurrent of concern that everyone could feel but no one could quite articulate. The staff members had noticed the changes in their employers, the private meetings with advisors, the hushed phone conversations, and the general atmosphere of tension that had been building over the past several weeks. As they walked through the palace halls toward the ballroom, Alexander and Sophia were acutely aware that they were retracing steps that had been taken by countless generations of their predecessors. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch them with expressions that ranged from benevolent approval to stern judgment. And Alexander found himself wondering what those long-dead relatives would think of the decision he and Sophia had made. The sound of conversation and laughter grew louder as they approached the ballroom, where 300 of the kingdom's most prominent citizens were enjoying cocktails and canapés while they waited for the evening's program to begin. These were the people who had supported the monarchy through their charitable contributions, their business partnerships, and their unwavering public loyalty. They were also the people who would feel most betrayed when they learned how that loyalty had been exploited. Just before entering the ballroom, Alexander and Sophia paused in the anteroom, where they had waited before so many other royal functions. Tonight, however, instead of the usual excited anticipation, they felt the weight of history pressing down upon them. They were about to step onto a stage where they would either destroy everything their family had built or find a way to rebuild it on a foundation of truth rather than lies. The massive oak doors to the ballroom stood before them, and beyond those doors waited their destiny, and the destiny of everyone who had placed their faith in the idea that royalty could still represent the best aspirations of human society. The ballroom of Valdoria Palace had witnessed countless historic moments throughout its existence, but none quite like the scene that unfolded as Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Sophia made their entrance. The massive crystal chandeliers cast their warm light over an assembly that represented the very heart of Valdorian society. Business leaders who had built their fortunes alongside the royal family's investments sat next to diplomats whose careers had been shaped by the monarchy's international relationships. Charitable organizations that had received royal patronage mingled with media representatives who had spent years crafting the public image of a modern progressive royal family. The couple moved through the crowd with practiced grace, exchanging pleasantries and accepting well wishes from guests who had no inkling of what was about to transpire. Lady Margaret Thornbury, the kingdom's most prominent socialite and a longtime friend of the royal family, embraced Sophia warmly while commenting on how radiant she looked. Sir David Richardson, whose shipping company had benefited from several royal trade missions, shook Alexander's hand enthusiastically while expressing his anticipation for the evening's announcement. "Whatever you're planning to share with us tonight," Sir David said with a conspiratorial smile, "I hope it involves more of those wonderful cultural exchange programs." The last one brought tremendous business opportunities. Alexander managed a weak smile in response, knowing that Sir David's shipping empire had unknowingly transported some of the illegal arms shipments that had enriched the royal coffers decades earlier. The irony of the man's innocent enthusiasm was almost unbearable. As the formal program began, the assembled guests took their seats at elegantly appointed round tables, each centerpiece featuring the white roses that had been the symbol of the House of Valdoria for 8 centuries. The national anthem played, performed by the Royal Chamber Orchestra, and the familiar melody that usually filled Alexander with pride now seemed to mock the deception they were about to expose. Queen Isabella, Alexander's mother, rose from her place at the head table to deliver the opening remarks. At 68, she remained a commanding presence, her silver hair styled in the elegant chignon that had become her signature, her posture reflecting decades of royal training. She had been kept informed about the discovery and the decision to reveal it, though the full weight of the revelation had taken weeks to truly settle in her mind. "My dear friends," the Queen began, her voice carrying easily through the acoustically perfect ballroom, "tonight marks a significant moment in the history of our beloved kingdom. Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Sophia have asked for this opportunity to address you, and through you, our entire nation, about matters that will shape our future in ways we are only beginning to understand." The Queen's carefully chosen words were designed to prepare the audience without revealing too much. But even she seemed to struggle with the magnitude of what was about to unfold. As she yielded the podium to her son, the silence in the room was complete except for the soft whir of television cameras that were broadcasting the event live to millions of viewers across the kingdom and beyond. Alexander approached the podium with measured steps, his military bearing evident even as he carried the invisible burden of the truth he was about to share. Behind him, a large screen had been prepared to display documents and photographs that would support his presentation, though the technical team had no idea what images they would be showing to the world. "Citizens of Valdoria, honored guests, members of the media," Alexander began, his voice clear but heavy with emotion. "What I am about to share with you represents perhaps the most difficult moment in the 800-year history of our monarchy. 3 months ago, Princess Sophia and I discovered information that has fundamentally changed our understanding of our family's legacy and our role as servants of this kingdom."
A murmur rippled through the audience as people began to sense that this was not going to be the celebratory announcement they had expected.
At the media table, reporters who had come prepared to cover routine royal event began reaching for their phones and tablets, their journalistic instincts alerting them that they were witnessing something unprecedented. "The discovery came about by accident," Alexander continued. "During renovation work on the east wing of the palace, workers found a hidden room that contained documents spanning nearly a century. Documents that reveal actions taken by previous generations of our family that fundamentally contradict the values we have claimed to represent. The screen behind him illuminated with the image of the hidden room as it was first discovered, showing shelves lined with carefully organized files and boxes. The audience stared in fascination, still not fully grasping the implications of what they were seeing. Sophia stood from her seat at the head table and joined her husband at the podium, her presence offering him strength as he prepared to reveal the most damaging information. Together, they represented a new generation of royalty, one that had been raised with modern values of transparency and accountability, making their current situation all the more painful. "The documents we found," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "reveal that King Edmund, my husband's beloved grandfather, was involved in illegal arms trading that spanned several decades. These operations generated enormous profits that were used to fund the royal family's lifestyle while being hidden from Parliament, the people, and even from other members of our own family." The reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps echoed through the ballroom as the assembled guests struggled to process what they had just heard. King Edmund had been one of the most revered monarchs in Valdorian history, remembered for his patronage of the arts, his support for education, and his dignified leadership during several international crises. The suggestion that he had been involved in arms trafficking seemed impossible to reconcile with everything they thought they knew about the man. Alexander took over the narrative, his voice growing stronger as he moved past the initial revelation. The arms sales involved conflicts in Eastern Europe and parts of Africa during the 1980s and 1990s. King Edmund's network sold weapons to multiple sides in these conflicts, maximizing profits while contributing to prolonged violence and suffering. The screen now displayed copies of shipping manifests and financial records, the official letterheads and signatures clearly visible to the audience and television viewers. Each document had been carefully verified by the historians and forensic accountants who had been quietly consulted over the past weeks. The total profits from these operations exceeded €200 million over a 15-year period, Sophia continued. This money was laundered through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts, then used to fund palace renovations, art acquisitions, foreign travel, and other expenditures that far exceeded what our official budget could support. Lady Thornbury, sitting in the front row, had gone completely pale, her champagne glass trembling in her hands. Her own family had made substantial contributions to royal charities over the years, believing they were supporting noble causes. The revelation that the royal family had been secretly enriched through arms dealing while accepting charitable donations from loyal subjects was devastating to everything she believed about noblesse oblige. The broader implications began to sink in as Alexander continued his presentation. The corruption extended beyond financial crimes. "We have found evidence that our family used its influence to suppress investigations, discredit journalists who came too close to the truth, and manipulate regulatory processes to protect the illegal operations." He displayed a series of documents showing communications between royal advisors and government officials, revealing how palace influence had been used to derail investigations and silence whistleblowers. The carefully maintained separation between the monarchy and partisan politics, a cornerstone of modern constitutional monarchy, had been repeatedly violated in service of protecting criminal activities. Dr. James Morrison, the investigative journalist who died in a car accident in 1994, had been preparing to publish a story about suspicious royal finances, Sophia revealed, her voice breaking slightly as she shared this information. "We have found evidence suggesting that his death was not accidental, though we have turned this information over to law enforcement for proper investigation." The implications of possible murder sent shockwaves through the audience and the viewing public. Dr. Morrison had been a respected journalist known for his meticulous research and his commitment to uncovering corruption in high places. His death had been mourned by the journalism community, but it had never been questioned as anything other than a tragic accident. Charles Whitmore, standing with the other senior staff members along the wall of the ballroom, felt his legs begin to give way. James, one of the younger butlers, quickly moved to support him as the full horror of the revelations began to sink in. Charles had dedicated his entire adult life to serving what he believed was an honorable institution, and the discovery that his decades of loyalty had been in service to criminals was almost too much to bear. "We want to be absolutely clear," Alexander said, his voice rising to ensure everyone could hear him clearly, "that neither my parents nor I had any knowledge of these activities while they were taking place. My father, King Frederick, spent his entire reign believing he was continuing a legacy of honor and service. These secrets died with King Edmund and his closest advisors." This clarification provided some relief to those who had known and respected Alexander's parents, but it also raised difficult questions about how such massive criminal operations could have been conducted without broader knowledge within the palace hierarchy. The Crown Prince moved to the most difficult part of his presentation, the part that would determine the future of the monarchy itself. Princess Sophia and I have spent the past 3 months grappling with how to respond to these discoveries. We consulted with historians, legal experts, ethical advisors, and religious leaders. The question we faced was whether to reveal this information knowing the damage it would cause, or to keep these secrets buried and continue living a lie. We have concluded, Sophia said, stepping closer to the microphone, that the only way forward that preserves any integrity for this institution is complete transparency and accountability. We cannot continue to accept the love and loyalty of our people while hiding the crimes that funded the very luxury they see as symbols of national pride. The audience sat in stunned silence as the implications of this statement began to sink in. The royal couple was not just revealing historical crimes, they were fundamentally challenging the entire basis upon which the modern monarchy operated. Effective immediately, Alexander announced, we are implementing the following changes to ensure that the House of Valdoria can move forward with integrity and transparency. The screen behind him displayed a comprehensive reform package that represented months of careful planning and consultation with constitutional experts. The reforms were radical by any historical standard, but Alexander and Sophia had concluded that nothing less would be sufficient to restore moral authority to their positions. First, all assets that can be traced to the illegal arms trading will be donated to humanitarian organizations working in the regions that were affected by the conflicts we helped to perpetuate. This includes artwork, properties, and financial investments totaling approximately 150 million euros in current value. The financial implications were staggering. The Royal Art Collection, considered one of the finest private collections in Europe, would be largely dismantled. Several properties that had been in the royal family for generations would be sold, with the proceeds going to organizations working with refugees and victims of armed conflicts. Second, we are establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that will have full access to all royal archives and complete authority to investigate any aspect of royal activities over the past century. This commission will be led by independent experts with no ties to the palace, and their findings will be made public in their entirety. This commitment to transparency went far beyond what even the most progressive monarchies had ever attempted. By opening their entire historical record to independent scrutiny, Alexander and Sophia were essentially inviting further revelations that might be even more damaging than what they had already disclosed. Third, we are implementing new oversight mechanisms that will ensure complete transparency in all future royal activities. All royal finances will be subject to annual independent audits with public reporting. All official royal activities will be documented and made available for public review, and all royal staff will receive training in ethical conduct and whistleblower protection. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, found herself thinking about the implications for her daily work. The casual privacy that had always surrounded royal family life would be fundamentally altered, with every expenditure and activity subject to public scrutiny. Finally, Sophia said, her voice growing stronger as she reached the conclusion of their presentation, we are calling upon Parliament to review and reform the constitutional role of the monarchy in our democracy. We believe that the institution we represent must earn its place in modern Valdorian society through service and transparency, not through historical tradition or inherited privilege. This last announcement was perhaps the most shocking of all. By voluntarily subjecting their role to parliamentary review, Alexander and Sophia were essentially offering to eliminate their own positions if the people's representatives determined that the monarchy was no longer beneficial to the kingdom. The silence that followed was profound and unsettling. 300 of the most prominent citizens of Valdoria sat in their chairs, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The royal couple had not just revealed historical crimes, they had voluntarily dismantled the mystique and privilege that had surrounded the monarchy for centuries. Alexander looked out over the assembled guests, seeing shock, disappointment, anger, and in some faces, a grudging respect for the courage it had taken to make these revelations. We know that many of you feel betrayed, and we understand that anger. We know that many of you will never forgive us for destroying something you believed in, and we accept that consequence. But we also hope, Sophia added, that some of you will see this moment not as an ending, but as a beginning. A chance to build something better, something based on truth rather than tradition. Something that earns respect through actions rather than demanding it through heredity. The first person to rise from their seat was Dr. Mossad. Elizabeth Harrison, the historian who had helped authenticate the documents. Her applause was tentative at first, but it gradually grew stronger as she recognized the unprecedented courage it had taken to make these revelations. Slowly, others began to join her, though the applause was far from universal. At the media table, reporters were frantically typing on their phones and laptops, knowing that they were witnessing one of the most significant political events in European history. The international implications alone would dominate headlines for months, as other monarchies grappled with questions about their own historical secrets. As the formal presentation concluded, Alexander and Sophia remained at the podium to take questions from the audience and the media. The questions came quickly and without mercy. How long had they known? Why had they chosen to reveal the information now? What other secrets might still be hidden? How could they guarantee that this level of corruption would never happen again? They acknowledged their own privilege in being able to choose transparency, recognizing that many victims of corruption never have such opportunities. They admitted their fears about the consequences of their revelations, while maintaining their conviction that truth was more important than comfort. The evening that was supposed to have been a celebration of royal tradition instead became a funeral for the old way of doing things. As guests began to leave the ballroom, their conversations were subdued and their expressions thoughtful. Some left in anger, feeling that their loyalty had been betrayed. Others left with a sense of possibility, wondering if this dramatic break with the past might lead to something better. The royal staff, meanwhile, faced their own crisis of faith. Many had devoted their entire careers to serving an institution they now learned had been built partly on criminal foundations. Some, like Charles, struggled with whether they could continue in their positions. Others, particularly the younger staff members, found themselves energized by the possibility of serving a reformed and transparent monarchy. As the ballroom emptied and the television cameras were turned off, Alexander and Sophia stood alone on the stage where they had just changed the course of history. The decision had been made, the truth had been told, and there was no going back. Whatever came next, they would face it together, having chosen integrity over comfort and truth over tradition. The real work of rebuilding would begin the next morning. But for now, they simply stood together in the empty ballroom, surrounded by the remnants of a world that no longer existed and facing an uncertain future that they had chosen to create. The dawn following the revelation brought no relief to Valdoria Palace, where the weight of the previous night's announcement settled over the ancient stones like a suffocating fog. Crown Prince Alexander had not slept, instead spending the dark hours pacing the private gardens while his mind raced through the immediate consequences of their decision. The carefully maintained rose bushes and manicured lawns seemed to mock him with their perfection, representing a world of order and beauty that had been built on foundations of lies and blood money. Princess Sophia found him there as the first rays of sunlight broke through the morning clouds, her face showing the strain of a sleepless night spent fielding phone calls from relatives, advisors, and government officials. She carried 2 cups of coffee, a simple gesture that somehow felt more intimate and meaningful than any of the elaborate ceremonies they had performed together as royals. "The Prime Minister wants an emergency meeting," she said, settling beside him on the stone bench that overlooked the palace's famous fountain. "Margaret's been calling every hour since midnight." Apparently, the opposition party is calling for a vote of no confidence, and there are rumors that several European monarchies are considering breaking diplomatic relations. Alexander accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how the simple white mug seemed almost alien after years of drinking from fine china bearing the royal crest. "What about the media response?" "Mixed," Sophia replied, pulling up news reports on her tablet. "The international press is calling it either the most courageous act in modern royal history or the most devastating self-destruction of a monarchy since the Russian Revolution. The domestic coverage is complicated." She scrolled through headlines that ranged from supportive to scathing. The liberal newspapers praised their transparency and courage, while conservative publications expressed outrage at the betrayal of national traditions. Social media had exploded with debates that were already becoming deeply polarized, with hashtags supporting and condemning the royal couple trending simultaneously. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path announced the approach of Charles Whitmore, though the elderly butler's usually precise gait seemed somehow diminished. His uniform was impeccable as always, but his face showed the strain of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered overnight. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed to create distance where none had existed before. "I apologize for disturbing you, but there are several matters that require your immediate attention." "Charles," Alexander said gently, "please sit with us. You've been part of this family for over 4 decades. Whatever formalities the situation might require, you don't need to observe them when we're alone." The butler's composure cracked slightly, and for the first time in either royal's memory, Charles accepted the invitation to sit in their presence without being explicitly commanded to do so. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his jacket, and Sophia noticed that his eyes were red-rimmed from what had likely been his own sleepless night. "I must tell you," Charles said quietly, "that the staff is struggling. Mrs. Patterson has been crying since the announcement ended. Some of the younger employees are talking about resigning, while others are asking whether they'll be implicated in any legal proceedings. The gardening staff is particularly upset because several of them were involved in maintaining areas of the palace that were apparently funded by the money you described. The human cost of their revelation was beginning to manifest in ways that Alexander and Sophia had anticipated intellectually but were now experiencing emotionally. These were people who had dedicated their lives to what they believed was honorable service, and their sense of betrayal was perhaps even more profound than that felt by the general public. "Charles," Sophia said, leaning forward with obvious concern, "we want you to know that we never considered any of the staff responsible for the actions of previous generations. You and everyone who works here have served with dignity and honor, regardless of what King Edmund did in secret." "But don't you see," Charles replied, his voice breaking slightly, "it doesn't matter what we intended. My father told me stories about serving King Edmund, about how proud he was to work for such a noble man. I've told those same stories to new staff members, encouraging them to take pride in continuing that legacy. I've been perpetuating a lie for my entire career without knowing it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir James Morrison, the palace's senior legal advisor, whose grim expression suggested that he carried news that would make their situation even more complicated. A distinguished man in his 60s, Sir James had served the royal family for over 20 years, and his expertise in constitutional law had been invaluable during the preparation for the previous night's announcement. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said, slightly out of breath from his hurried walk across the palace grounds, "I'm afraid we have several urgent legal matters to address. The Attorney General's office has formally opened an investigation into the arms-dealing allegations, and they're requesting full access to all documents and records. Additionally, Interpol has contacted the Foreign Ministry about potential international criminal implications." Alexander had expected legal consequences, but the speed with which formal investigations were being launched was dizzying. "What are our obligations regarding cooperation?" "Complete cooperation is not just legally required. It's essential for maintaining any credibility," Sir James replied. "However, I must warn you that this investigation could uncover additional information that might be even more damaging. The documents you found represent only what King Edmund chose to preserve. There may be other evidence that paints an even worse picture." The possibility of additional revelations hung over them like a sword. They had made their decision based on the information they possessed, but the investigation might reveal crimes they hadn't even imagined. Their conversation was again interrupted, this time by the approach of Margaret Hartwell, Alexander's private secretary, whose usually perfect composure was showing signs of strain. Behind her walked Dr. Patricia Wells, a crisis management consultant who had been quietly retained several weeks earlier to help prepare for this moment. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said, consulting her tablet with the efficiency that had made her indispensable to palace operations, "we have 17 interview requests from international media organizations, including requests from the BBC, CNN, and German public television. The French ambassador has requested an urgent meeting, and the Spanish royal family has issued a statement expressing their deep concern about the revelations." Dr. Wells, a sharp-eyed woman whose expertise had guided numerous high-profile clients through public relations disasters, stepped forward with her own assessment. "The international reaction is developing along predictable lines. Republican movements in several European countries are using your revelations to argue for the abolition of their own monarchies. Conversely, some constitutional scholars are praising your transparency as a model for how hereditary institutions can adapt to modern democratic values." "What about domestic public opinion?" Sophia asked, though she dreaded the answer. "It's deeply divided, Dr. Chair," Wells replied honestly. "Our preliminary polling shows that about 35% of the population supports your decision to reveal the truth, 35% strongly opposes it, and 30% are undecided. However, these numbers are likely to shift significantly as people have time to process the implications." The polarization was exactly what they had feared most. Rather than bringing the nation together around shared values of honesty and accountability, their revelation was threatening to tear the country apart along ideological lines. Alexander stood from the bench and walked to the fountain, where the sound of flowing water provided a moment of peace amid the chaos surrounding them. "Dr. Wells, what are the realistic scenarios for how this develops over the next few weeks?" "There are essentially 3 possible paths," she replied, joining him by the fountain while the others gathered around. First, the investigation could reveal that the scope of the corruption was limited to what you've already disclosed, public opinion could gradually shift towards supporting your transparency, and you could emerge as leaders of a reformed and more legitimate monarchy. That's the optimistic scenario, Alexander said. What's the pessimistic one? The investigation uncovers additional crimes, possibly including more recent activities. Public support collapses entirely, and Parliament votes to abolish the monarchy. In that scenario, you would likely face pressure to abdicate, and possibly to leave the country entirely. And the third scenario, prolonged uncertainty. The investigation drags on for months or years, public opinion remains divided, and the monarchy exists in a state of limbo, where you have neither the moral authority of the past nor the clear mandate of a reformed institution. That might actually be the worst outcome, because it leaves everyone unsatisfied and the country unable to move forward. The weight of these possibilities settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Each scenario carried profound implications not just for Alexander and Sophia personally, but for every person who worked at the palace and for the broader constitutional structure of the kingdom. Mrs. Patterson approached the group hesitantly, her usually confident demeanor replaced by obvious uncertainty. As head housekeeper, she had been responsible for maintaining the private quarters where the royal family lived, including rooms that had been furnished and decorated with money from the illegal arms sales. Her sense of complicity, though entirely innocent, was clearly causing her significant distress. "Your Royal Highnesses," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to ask about the staff situation. Many of us have worked here for decades, and we have families who depend on our employment. If the palace operations are significantly reduced, or if the monarchy is... if changes are made, what will happen to our positions?" The human dimension of their crisis was perhaps the most painful aspect for both Alexander and Sophia. They had made their decision based on principles of truth and accountability, but the people who would suffer most from the consequences were the innocent staff members who had devoted their lives to serving the institution. "Mrs. Patterson," Sophia said, moving to take the older woman's hands in her own, "I want to assure you that regardless of what happens to the monarchy as an institution, Alexander and I will personally ensure that every staff member who wishes to continue working has a position, and that anyone who chooses to leave receives adequate compensation to transition to new employment. But we can't promise that those positions will be here at the palace," Alexander added honestly. "If Parliament decides to significantly reduce the royal household, or to abolish the monarchy entirely, we may not have the authority to maintain current staffing levels. However, we will use whatever personal resources we have to honor our obligations to the people who have served us faithfully." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Father Miguel Rodriguez, the palace chaplain, whose presence seemed to bring a sense of calm to the gathering storm of practical concerns. A thoughtful man in his 50s whose counsel had been valued by the royal family for over a decade, Father Miguel had been one of the few people consulted before the decision to make the revelations public. "I thought you might benefit from some perspective," he said, settling himself on the stone wall that surrounded the fountain area. "I've been reflecting on our conversations over the past months, and I want to share something that might be helpful as you navigate the challenges ahead." "Please," Alexander said gratefully, recognizing that they needed wisdom from someone whose perspective transcended immediate political and practical concerns. "Throughout history," Father Miguel began, "institutions have faced moments when they must choose between preserving their power and preserving their integrity. Those that choose power often survive in the short term but ultimately lose their moral authority and become hollow shells of their former selves. Those that choose integrity often face immediate suffering but have the possibility of rebirth and renewal." He paused, looking around at the assembled group. "You have chosen integrity, knowing that it might cost you everything. That choice, regardless of its consequences, has already transformed you from rulers who demand respect to leaders who have earned it through courage." Charles, who had been listening intently, spoke up for the first time since the others had joined them. "Father, I appreciate what you're saying, but it's difficult to find comfort in abstract principles. When our entire world has been turned upside down, how do we reconcile serving an institution that we've just learned was built partly on criminal activity?" "That's precisely the point," Father McGill replied. "You're no longer serving the same institution. The monarchy that existed yesterday was built on secrets and maintained through deception. The institution you're now part of is committed to truth and accountability. They may have the same name and occupy the same buildings, but they are fundamentally different entities." This perspective offered some comfort to the staff members, though the practical challenges remained overwhelming. Dr. Wells, who had been taking notes throughout the conversation, looked up from her tablet with a new thought. "We need to consider the international implications more carefully," she said. "Your revelation is already being used by Republican movements across Europe to argue against monarchy in general. But it's also being cited by transparency advocates as proof that hereditary institutions can reform themselves. The way you handle the next few months could influence the future of constitutional monarchy across multiple countries." The global significance of their actions was both humbling and terrifying. They had made their decision based on what they believed was right for their own kingdom, but the consequences were rippling outward in ways they were only beginning to understand. Margaret consulted her tablet again, noting the steady stream of messages and requests that were arriving throughout their discussion. "I should mention that we've received several offers of support from unexpected sources. The Norwegian royal family has issued a statement praising your courage, and there are reports that the Swedish crown princess has privately expressed admiration for your decision. We've also received condemnation from predictable quarters," Dr. Wells added. "Several heads of state have expressed concern about the stability implications, and there are rumors that some European monarchies are considering reducing their diplomatic engagement with Valdoria until the situation stabilizes." As the morning progressed, the full scope of their new reality began to come into focus. The investigation would proceed regardless of their cooperation, though their full participation would be essential for maintaining any credibility. Public opinion would evolve unpredictably, influenced by new revelations, media coverage, and political developments. The staff would need ongoing support and reassurance as they grappled with their own sense of betrayal and uncertainty. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander and Sophia realized that they were no longer simply revealing historical crimes. They were actively creating a new model for how hereditary institutions might function in the 21st century. The success or failure of their experiment would influence debates about monarchy, democracy, and leadership for generations to come. As the group began to disperse to attend to their various responsibilities, Alexander and Sophia found themselves alone again by the fountain. The water continued to flow as it had for centuries, indifferent to the human dramas that played out around it.
"Do you regret it?"
Sophia asked quietly, referring not just to the previous night's announcement, but to the entire chain of decisions that had brought them to this moment. Alexander considered the question seriously, looking out over the palace grounds where staff members were going about their daily routines despite the upheaval surrounding them. "I regret the pain we've caused to people who didn't deserve it," he said finally. "But I don't regret choosing truth over lies. Whatever happens next, at least it will be built on an honest foundation." The first full day after their revelation was drawing to a close, and already their old world was fading into memory. Whatever emerged from the chaos they had created, it would be something entirely new, something that honored both the best traditions of their heritage and the demands of modern ethical leadership. The hardest part was accepting that they might not survive the transformation they had initiated, but that the principles they were fighting for were more important than their personal comfort or survival. 6 weeks after the revelation that shook the foundations of the Valdorian monarchy, the palace had transformed into something resembling a crime scene more than a royal residence. Teams of forensic accountants worked alongside international investigators in rooms that had once hosted state dinners and diplomatic receptions. The Grand Library, with its leather-bound volumes and priceless manuscripts, now served as a makeshift headquarters for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, while the East Wing remained cordoned off as investigators meticulously documented every detail of the hidden room that had started it all. Crown Prince Alexander stood at the window of what had been his grandfather's study, watching as investigators carried boxes of documents to waiting vehicles. The irony was not lost on him that King Edmund's private sanctuary, where the old monarch had planned his illegal operations, was now being systematically dismantled by the very authorities he had spent decades evading. The investigation had already exceeded everyone's worst expectations. What began as evidence of arms dealing had expanded into a comprehensive examination of royal finances dating back nearly a century. Each new discovery seemed to reveal additional layers of corruption and deception, creating a cascade of revelations that kept the media in a constant state of frenzy and the public in a perpetual state of shock. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead investigator for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, knocked softly on the study door before entering. A respected forensic accountant who had previously investigated corporate fraud cases involving billions of dollars, Dr. Chen had approached the royal investigation with the same methodical precision that had made her reputation. Her findings over the past 6 weeks had been both more extensive and more damaging than anyone had anticipated. "Your Royal Highness," she said, settling into the chair across from Alexander's desk, with the familiarity that had developed during their frequent meetings. "I'm afraid I have more difficult news to share." Alexander had come to dread these conversations, though he appreciated Dr. Chen's direct approach and her refusal to soften the blow of each new discovery. Please, go ahead. We've traced the financial networks back to the 1930s, and the pattern of illegal activity is more extensive than we initially believed. It appears that your great-grandfather, King Robert, was involved in currency manipulation during the economic crisis of 1938, and there's evidence suggesting that the royal family profited from both sides during the early stages of World War II. The implications were staggering. If the corruption extended back that far, it meant that virtually every aspect of the modern monarchy had been built on illegal foundations. The beloved Queen Mother, Alexander's grandmother, would have lived her entire married life benefiting from criminal proceeds without necessarily knowing their source. There's also evidence, Dr. Chen continued, consulting her tablet, that the arms-dealing operations didn't end with King Edmund's death as we initially believed. Some of the shell companies continued operating until at least 2110, though the profits were being diverted to offshore accounts rather than directly funding royal activities. This revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. If illegal operations had continued into the 21st century, it meant that his own father, King Frederick, might have known about or even participated in criminal activities. The man Alexander had revered as a model of ethical leadership might have been complicit in the very corruption they were now exposing. Do you have evidence that my father knew about these operations? Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Not direct evidence, Dr. Chen replied carefully. The diverted profits suggest that someone was deliberately keeping the money away from royal accounts, possibly to maintain plausible deniability for the active monarch. However, the sophistication of the operations suggests institutional knowledge within the palace hierarchy. The possibility that his father had known about the corruption while maintaining a public facade of ethical leadership was almost too painful to contemplate. Alexander had built his own sense of identity around the belief that his parents represented the best traditions of service and duty, and the thought that this too might have been an illusion threatened to undermine his entire understanding of himself and his role. Princess Sophia entered the study carrying 2 cups of tea, a ritual that had become their anchor during the weeks of constant revelations. Her face showed the strain of serving as the primary liaison with international media, while simultaneously managing the emotional needs of a staff that felt increasingly betrayed and confused.
The BBC interview went as well as could be expected,
she reported, settling into the third chair around Alexander's desk. They focused primarily on our decision-making process and our plans for the future, rather than dwelling on the historical details. However, they did ask directly whether we would consider abdicating if public support continues to decline. What did you tell them? That we're committed to seeing the investigation through to its conclusion and implementing whatever reforms are necessary to restore integrity to the institution. I avoided making any commitments about our personal future, but I think the question itself suggests how seriously the media is taking the possibility of abdication. Dr. Chen cleared her throat diplomatically. If I may, Your Royal Highnesses, the international investigation is raising questions that extend beyond the monarchy's survival. Several European governments are expressing concern about potential money laundering through their banking systems, and there are discussions about whether criminal charges might be filed against surviving participants. What about statute of limitations issues? Alexander asked, though he wasn't sure whether he hoped that legal protections might limit the consequences or that justice might finally be served regardless of time constraints. The international nature of the crimes and the ongoing money laundering operations until 2010 could extend the applicable statutes considerably. Additionally, some jurisdictions have no statute of limitations for certain types of arms dealing, particularly when the weapons were used in conflicts that resulted in war crimes. The legal implications were becoming as complex as the ethical ones. Even if Alexander and Sophia survived politically, they might face years of legal proceedings as witnesses, defendants, or both. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles Whitmore, whose appearance had continued to deteriorate as each new revelation challenged his understanding of his life's work. The elderly butler had lost weight and seemed to have aged years in the few weeks since the initial announcement. Your Royal Highnesses, he said, his voice carrying an exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical fatigue. I have a request that I find difficult to make but necessary to address. Of course, Charles, what can we do for you? I would like permission to cooperate fully with the investigators, even if it means revealing information that might be damaging to the royal family. Charles paused, struggling with the words. My father kept detailed records of his service to King Edmund, and I have continued that tradition throughout my own career. These records might contain information that could help the investigators understand how the illegal operations functioned. Alexander and Sophia exchanged glances, recognizing both the courage and the pain behind Charles's request. The butler was offering to potentially incriminate the family he had served loyally for over 4 decades, but he was also recognizing that truth was more important than loyalty to a compromised institution. "Charles," Sophia said gently, "we not only give you permission to cooperate fully, we encourage it. The only way forward is complete transparency, regardless of how much it hurts." "There's something else," Charles continued, his voice growing even quieter. "Some of the younger staff members have been talking about writing tell-all books about their experiences here. They feel betrayed and angry, and they're being approached by publishers and journalists who are offering significant sums for insider information." This development represented a new dimension of their crisis. If former staff members began revealing palace secrets without any regard for accuracy or context, the investigation could be contaminated by sensationalized accounts that mixed truth with gossip and speculation. Dr. Chen made a note on her tablet. "We should probably accelerate our staff interviews to get official statements before any unauthorized publications appear. The integrity of our investigation depends on having access to first-hand accounts before they're potentially altered by media influence or financial incentives." The practical challenges of managing the investigation were becoming as complex as the underlying crimes they were examining. Every decision about how to proceed carried potential consequences that could affect the outcome, and there were no precedents for how to handle a situation of this magnitude. Margaret Hartwell knocked and entered, her tablet displaying what had become a familiar sight: urgent messages and requests that required immediate attention. "Your Royal Highness, I have several updates that need your consideration. First, Parliament has scheduled a formal debate on the monarchy's future for next month. Second, the Spanish and Belgian royal families have issued a joint statement distancing themselves from the Valdorian situation. And third, we've received a request from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime to participate in their investigation of international arms trafficking networks. The UN involvement represented a new level of international scrutiny that could have implications far beyond the Kingdom of Valdoria. If their investigation became part of a broader effort to track illegal weapons sales, other governments and institutions might find themselves implicated in ways they never anticipated. There's also some potentially positive news," Margaret continued. "Professor Elena Vasquez from the University of Madrid has published an article praising your transparency as a model for institutional accountability. She argues that your approach could inspire reforms in other hereditary institutions, including corporate dynasties and political families that have operated without oversight for generations. The possibility that their crisis might inspire positive change elsewhere provided some comfort, though Alexander and Sophia remained focused primarily on the immediate challenges facing their own kingdom." Chen gathered her materials, preparing to return to her investigation. "I should mention that we're expecting to complete the financial analysis within the next 2 weeks. At that point, we'll have a comprehensive picture of the scope and duration of the illegal activities. I want to prepare you for the possibility that the final report will be even more damaging than what we've discussed so far." After Dr. Chen left, the 3 remaining in the room sat in contemplative silence. The investigation had taken on a life of its own, revealing layers of corruption that none of them had imagined when they first discovered the hidden room. Each new revelation made their original decision to come forward seem both more necessary and more devastating. "I've been thinking about what Father Miguel said about institutions choosing between power and integrity," Alexander said finally. "But I'm starting to wonder whether we even have the option to choose power anymore. The revelations are so extensive that preserving the monarchy might not be possible regardless of what we want." "Maybe that's not the right question," Sophia replied. "Maybe the question is whether we can create something new from the ruins of what came before. The monarchy as it existed is probably gone forever. But that doesn't mean there's no role for reformed hereditary leadership in a modern democracy." Charles, who had been listening intently, offered his own perspective. "In my 43 years of service, I've watched this institution evolve considerably. The monarchy I began serving was much more traditional and formal than what exists today. Perhaps what we're experiencing now is simply a more dramatic version of the adaptation that has always been necessary for survival." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of protesters outside the palace gates, a daily occurrence that had begun shortly after the initial revelations. Today's crowd seemed larger than usual, and their chants were audible even through the thick palace walls. Some were calling for the abolition of the monarchy, while others were demanding that Alexander and Sophia abdicate in favor of a more distant relative who might be less tainted by the recent revelations. Margaret returned with updates from the palace security team. The protest today includes representatives from several European Republican movements who have traveled here to support the local activists. They're being joined by some former royal staff members who have been speaking to the media about their experiences working here. The sight of former employees joining the protest was particularly painful for Alexander and Sophia, though they understood the anger and sense of betrayal that motivated such actions. These were people who had dedicated years or decades of their lives to an institution that had deceived them about its true nature. "We need to make a decision about the parliamentary debate," Sophia said, returning to the practical challenges they faced. "Do we participate directly? Do we send representatives? Or do we allow Parliament to debate our future without our input?" "I think we have to participate directly," Alexander replied. "If we're asking the people to judge whether the monarchy deserves to continue existing, we owe them the courtesy of defending our position personally rather than hiding behind advisors and representatives." The decision to appear before Parliament would be unprecedented in modern Valdorian history. While monarchs had traditionally maintained ceremonial relationships with the legislative branch, they had never been required to defend their existence in formal debate. The spectacle would undoubtedly attract international attention, and could determine not just their personal fate, but the future of hereditary leadership in their kingdom. As evening approached, Alexander and Sophia walked through the palace corridors that might soon belong to someone else entirely. The portraits of their ancestors seemed to watch them with expressions that could be interpreted as either accusation or encouragement, depending on one's perspective. These long-dead monarchs had faced their own crises and challenges, though none quite like the situation that now confronted their descendants. "Whatever happens in Parliament," Sophia said as they reached their private quarters, "I want you to know that I'm proud of what we've done. We could have kept those secrets buried and lived comfortable lives built on lies. Instead, we chose to risk everything for the sake of truth. Even if it destroys us, especially if it destroys us. Better to be destroyed by truth than preserved by deception." The investigation would continue for several more weeks, and the parliamentary debate would determine their fate as monarchs. But Alexander and Sophia had already achieved something unprecedented in royal history. They had voluntarily surrendered the mystique and unquestioned authority that had protected monarchies for centuries, choosing instead to submit themselves to the judgment of the people they claimed to serve. Whether their gamble would result in a reformed and strengthened monarchy or the complete abolition of hereditary leadership remained to be seen. But their commitment to transparency had already changed the conversation about power, accountability, and leadership in ways that would influence political developments far beyond the borders of their small kingdom. 3 months after their world-changing revelation, Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Sophia stood at the entrance to the parliamentary chamber, facing the most consequential moment in the 800-year history of the House of Valdoria. The ornate wooden doors, carved with symbols representing the unity of Crown and Parliament, seemed to mock the constitutional crisis that had brought them to this unprecedented moment. Never before had sitting monarchs been required to defend their very existence before the elected representatives of their people. The chamber itself had been reconfigured for the historic debate, with additional seating installed to accommodate the international media and observers who had travelled from across Europe to witness what many considered the most significant constitutional moment of the 21st century. The atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation, as everyone present understood they were witnessing events that would be studied by historians for generations to come. Dr. Sarah Chen's final report, published 2 weeks earlier, had exceeded even the most pessimistic expectations for its scope and damning conclusions. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had documented over a century of systematic corruption, illegal arms dealing, money laundering, and political manipulation that had generated an estimated €400 million in illegal profits. The report confirmed that criminal activities had continued well into the 21st century and had implicated not just King Edmund, but potentially dozens of palace officials, government ministers, and business leaders who had participated in or benefited from the schemes. More devastatingly, the report had found circumstantial evidence suggesting that King Frederick, Alexander's beloved father, had likely known about at least some of the illegal operations during his reign. While no direct evidence of his participation had been discovered, the sophisticated nature of the money laundering operations and their integration with official royal activities made complete ignorance implausible for someone in his position. Alexander had spent the previous night reading and rereading his father's private papers, searching for any indication of the moral struggle that King Frederick must have faced if he had indeed known about the criminal activities. The absence of any such evidence was almost more painful than finding proof of complicity would have been, as it suggested either perfect compartmentalization or a level of self-deception that challenged everything Alexander thought he knew about his father's character. Prime Minister Margaret Thompson called the session to order, her voice carrying across the packed chamber with unusual gravity. A career politician known for her pragmatic approach to governance, Prime Minister Thompson had found herself managing the most complex constitutional crisis in the nation's modern history, while simultaneously dealing with the international implications of the royal revelations. Honourable members, she began. We gather today to address fundamental questions about the nature of our democracy and the role of hereditary institutions in modern society. The revelations concerning the House of Valdoria have forced us to examine not just the actions of past monarchs, but the very foundations upon which our constitutional system rests. The opposition leader James Crawford had spent weeks preparing for this moment, seeing it as the opportunity to finally achieve the Republican reforms that his party had advocated for decades. A former university professor with a reputation for intellectual rigor, Crawford had been careful to frame his arguments in terms of democratic principles rather than personal attacks on the royal family. Madam Prime Minister, Crawford said, rising from his seat with obvious satisfaction, while we acknowledge the courage shown by His Royal Highness and Princess Sophia in revealing these crimes, we must ask ourselves whether courage after the fact can compensate for a century of deception. The very institution of monarchy has been revealed to be fundamentally corrupted, and no amount of reform can restore legitimacy to a system built on criminal foundations. Alexander had anticipated this line of argument and had spent considerable time preparing his response. As he rose to address Parliament, he felt the weight of 8 centuries of royal tradition pressing down upon him, along with the knowledge that his words would likely determine whether that tradition would continue or come to an end. Honourable members of Parliament, Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. I stand before you today not to defend the crimes of my ancestors, but to argue for the possibility of redemption through truth and transformation. The House of Valdoria, as it existed until 3 months ago, deserves to be abolished. The question before us today is whether something new and better can be built from its ruins. He had decided to be completely forthright about the magnitude of the corruption, recognizing that any attempt to minimize the crimes would undermine his credibility and make reform impossible. The evidence presented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reveals systematic criminal activity spanning multiple generations. This corruption was not an aberration or a temporary departure from noble traditions. It was integral to how the modern monarchy functioned. The palaces, the art collections, the charitable foundations, the diplomatic influence, all of it was built partly on blood money generated through illegal arms sales and political manipulation. A murmur ran through the chamber as Alexander's words confirmed the worst fears of many parliamentarians. Even those who had supported the monarchy were struggling with the scope of the corruption and its implications for the institution's legitimacy. However, Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger, I would argue that the true test of any institution is not whether it has never failed, but whether it can acknowledge its failures and transform itself accordingly. Princess Sophia and I chose to reveal these crimes knowing that it would likely destroy us personally and possibly eliminate the monarchy entirely. We made that choice because we believe that no institution, regardless of its historical importance, deserves to survive if it cannot operate with integrity. Princess Sophia rose to join her husband at the podium, her presence serving as a visual reminder of their partnership in both the revelations and the proposed reforms. Her approval ratings, according to recent polling, had remained higher than Alexander's throughout the crisis, partly because she was seen as less directly connected to the corrupted royal bloodline. Members of Parliament, Sophia said, we are not here today to ask you to preserve the monarchy out of respect for tradition or sentiment. We are here to propose a completely new model for how hereditary leadership might function in a modern democracy. A model based on transparency, accountability, and service rather than privilege and secrecy. She outlined the comprehensive reform package that she and Alexandra had developed in consultation with constitutional experts, historians, and ethicists from across Europe. The proposals were radical by any historical standard, essentially creating a new institution that would bear little resemblance to traditional monarchy, while retaining some symbolic and ceremonial functions. Under our proposed reforms, Sophia continued, all royal finances would be completely transparent, with independent oversight and public reporting. All royal activities would be documented and subject to parliamentary review. The hereditary principle would be maintained but limited, with each potential monarch required to demonstrate competence and commitment to democratic values before assuming the throne. The reform package also included provisions for regular parliamentary review of the monarchy's continued existence. essentially making the institution subject to democratic approval every 10 years. This represented a complete inversion of traditional relationships between Crown and Parliament, with the monarchy serving at the pleasure of the people's representatives rather than claiming authority through divine right or historical precedent. Dr. Puckwish, Elizabeth Harrison, the historian who had first authenticated the discovered documents, had been invited to address Parliament as an expert witness. Her reputation for scholarly integrity and her obvious pain at the revelations had made her one of the most credible voices in the ongoing debates about the monarchy's future. "Honourable members," Dr. Harrison said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of historical research. "I have spent my entire career studying the monarchy with admiration and respect. The discoveries of the past 3 months have been devastating to everything I thought I knew about the institution I devoted my life to understanding." She paused, clearly struggling with the emotional weight of her testimony. "However, I have also had the opportunity to observe how Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Sophia have responded to these revelations. Their commitment to truth over comfort, their willingness to sacrifice their own positions for the sake of integrity, and their vision for radical reform represent something genuinely unprecedented in the history of hereditary leadership." Dr. Harrison's endorsement carried particular weight because of her obvious reluctance to support the continuation of an institution that had deceived her for so long. Her conclusion that the proposed reforms might create something worthwhile from the ruins of the corrupted monarchy influenced several undecided parliamentarians. The debate continued for hours, with representatives from across the political spectrum offering their perspectives on the monarchy's future. Some argued passionately for complete abolition, seeing the corruption as proof that hereditary institutions were incompatible with democratic governance. Others suggested that the royal couple's transparency and reform proposals deserve support as an experiment in institutional transformation. Charles Whitmore, now serving as the primary witness to the internal operations of the palace, provided testimony that was both damaging and sympathetic. His detailed accounts of how the criminal operations had been hidden from most staff members, while simultaneously describing the genuine service and dedication of many royal employees, painted a complex picture of an institution that had contained both nobility and corruption. "I have served this family for 43 years, Charles testified, his voice steady despite the obvious emotional strain. "And I can say with certainty that Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Sophia knew nothing about these crimes until they discovered the hidden documents. Their decision to reveal the truth, knowing it would destroy their own positions, demonstrates a level of integrity that I have rarely witnessed in my lifetime of service." As the debate moved towards its conclusion, both Alexander and Sophia were given final opportunities to address Parliament. They had prepared extensively for this moment, recognizing that their words would likely determine not just their own fate, but the future of constitutional monarchy as a concept. "Members of Parliament," Alexander said in his closing statement, "I want to be clear about what we are asking of you today.